Galatians 2:10. We had been talking about Paul's scope of his teaching. In other words, the Judaizers were contrasting Paul, what Paul had been teaching with the true gospel, and trying to run around and teach another gospel. Paul was saying, look, the difference is not in the gospel, it's in the scope. It's in the mission fields that we're going to. It's the same gospel, different mission fields. So anyway, we start in verse 10, is about where we left off. Galatians 2:10. Only they would, speaking of the people that he met with in the Jerusalem council, that we should remember the poor, which very thing I was zealous to do. This was the only exhortation that Peter, James, and John, and the rest of whoever was at the Jerusalem council had for Paul. This was all they had to add to what Paul had been teaching in his evangelistic efforts. That's it. He revealed the gospel to them, and the only thing that they added to him was that he should remember the poor, which is the very thing I was also zealous to do. Paul was already doing that. So, in other words, the only thing they had to add to what he had been doing was something that he was already been doing. That's it. They made no corrections, no alterations of any kind to what Paul had been preaching. The conclusion that we can draw from this is that Paul had been teaching the churches in Galatia the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and it was authoritative. On the other hand, what the churches in Galatia were being taught by the apostates coming out of Judea was false and utterly without divine authority of any kind. So, what we take from that is that, and again, this is Paul's defending himself against the people that had been going into the churches in Galatia and telling them that Paul wasn't teaching them the truth. So this is all part of what he was doing in his defense of himself and defending the gospel that he had been teaching them all along. And so we move into Galatians 2:11, and we move into another section of the book here. He kind of changes directions here, talking about Peter, and this is going to be further evidence by referring his personal rebuke of Peter in that he's standing unified with the doctrine that the apostles are teaching, but with what he'd been teaching the Gentiles, which was the same thing. I'm trying to say this right here. In what he's about, in this incident with Peter, he's going to demonstrate that he's not following after everything that happens in the lives of the other apostles, that they're not, he's not condemning so much Peter. This is not something that he's attacking Peter over. He's just making the case here that he's acting independently by the direct authority of Jesus Christ. Go ahead, CL.
Well, I was going to say, when he was saying to Peter here, he's already said that what he got, he was revealed to him, and so apparently that is something that was revealed to him that they can't see living this way and acting that way.
Right.
They can't do that, and so that's just further evidence of his authority. Really. Right.
Further evidence of the fact that he was not getting everything from the other apostles. And here is something, and we're going to read this verse here in just a second, but here is something that was kind of the key to the whole problem, is that Peter, they were all teaching the same thing, but when it came right down, when the rubber meets the road, and Peter's actually put to the test, he went the other way. He went the direction that was kind of in support of the apostates, and that's what Paul is pointing out. Hey, what I've been teaching you is the truth. Now here's Peter, who he did something that supports them, but I stood against that. Let's read verse 11. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. Galatians 2:11. But when Cephas, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I resisted him to the face because he stood condemned. After the Jerusalem council, it was decided to write a letter and send it with some of the leading men of the church in Jerusalem to Antioch. And we read that letter last week. And that's in Acts 15. While they were there, Paul took that letter and they went to Antioch. Well, while they were there, Peter shows up. He makes a visit to Antioch. Well, while on this visit, Peter at first was fellowshipping and eating with the Gentiles. But when some of the Judaizers came from Jerusalem, he withdrew and associated only with the Jewish Christians. He pulled back away from the Gentiles. Upon seeing this, Paul, who had just come from his successful trip to Jerusalem, where he had secured the unity and support of the Jerusalem church over this very issue, and carrying the letter that they wrote, which denied any form of Judaism, he witnessed Peter's hypocrisy and confronted him face to face about it. This is a powerful testament to the passion and boldness of Paul over this matter. Paul was a champion of the gospel. He was a true soldier of Christ in every respect. Paul confronted Peter to the face in front of his peers and in front of the Judaizers. We can draw a number of conclusions from this, but first we must acknowledge that Paul meant Peter no harm in this matter. Paul mentioned that Peter stood condemned. Therefore, Peter's actions had resulted in placing him in such a position that his eternal security was in jeopardy. Peter was in as much danger here as Simon the sorcerer was when he tried to buy the ability to pass on the miraculous spiritual gifts of the Holy Spirit that we read of in Acts 8:20. Peter confronted Simon on that occasion. Now Peter stood condemned for actions of his own, and Paul pointed out his error to him. One conclusion that we draw from this is the overwhelming influence that the Judaizing force had within the Christian community. The Judaizers were not successful in Jerusalem at the council, so they decided to follow these men to Antioch. They were not giving up easily and deliberately went to Antioch in order to pursue their efforts there. They had gone behind Paul before and had been successful, so now they were going back to what had worked in the past. Paul left the Jerusalem council with overwhelming support from the apostles in Jerusalem, but this did not stop the Judaizers. They were determined to do whatever was necessary in order to achieve their ends, which, if left unchecked, would have resulted in the condemnation of countless souls. Imagine what would have happened if Paul had not said anything at all to Peter on that occasion. Imagine the damage that would have done to the credibility of the true gospel. Paul knew all of this, and his purpose for confronting Peter had far-reaching implications. The hypocrisy of Peter on this instance would have fueled the fire of the Judaizers. They would have noticed this and would have been all the more determined in their efforts. Peter was not alone in this either. The racial prejudice which fueled this Judaizing heresy was deeply ingrained into the lives and the attitudes of the Jews. They had a lot of that to overcome, but this did not relinquish them from the obligation to do so. It is significant to keep in mind that Peter stood condemned for it. Their racial prejudice was serious, and so serious that when it reared its ugly head at that time, that Peter actually stood condemned. There is no room in the heart of any Christian for racial bigotry. It will open the door for all kinds of heresy within the Lord's church and will result in the condemnation of souls if left unchecked, as surely as it would have in the New Testament church of the first century. That racial bigotry, that racial prejudice, is kind of what was fueling all of this. And Peter stood condemned for it. Moving into Galatians 2:12. For before that, certain came from James. He ate with the Gentiles, but when they came, he, meaning Peter, drew back and separated himself, fearing them that were of the circumcision. The leaders of the Judaizing faction apparently approached James after Paul, Peter, and the rest of the group left Jerusalem. Apparently, after failing to find any support there, they set out on their own journey to Antioch in order to try and push their agenda there. This was their usual mode of operation, having been successful with similar tactics. The text appears to suggest that these Judaizers might have come from the presence of James bearing his approval. Such is not the case, as evidenced in the letter written by the spiritual leaders in Jerusalem, which demonstrates that they were all of one accord on this issue. and had already given Paul and company the right hand of fellowship. James was mentioned in that's coming from verse 9 of Acts, I believe, 15. James was mentioned as one of the pillars of the church which were in attendance at the council. In addition, the letter written by the leaders in Jerusalem stated in Acts 15:24, since we have heard that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your souls, saying you must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment. That's coming from the leaders at the Jerusalem council that Paul went to see. James is one of the authors of this letter, it being sent by his approval and with his authority, as well as the others being in the possession of those whom he had previously extended the right hand of fellowship to. These Judaizers were acting outside the approval of James back in Jerusalem. Therefore, having been unsuccessful with appealing to James in the absence of the others, they resorted to coming to Antioch directly with the intentions of bringing the Gentiles under the law of Moses. They weren't getting any support in Jerusalem after a bunch of them left. They weren't finding any satisfaction there, so basically they just set out on their own to try to push their agenda. Prior to the arrival of the Judaizers, Peter was eating and fellowshipping the Gentile Christians in Antioch as brethren. But when they showed up in Antioch and stirred up the prejudice which fueled the Judaizing heresy, Peter withdrew. He caved. And he withdrew from the association with the Gentiles. It is evident that Peter's defection was obvious to everyone there. Anything further on that before we move into verse 13? If not, then let's read verse 13. And the rest of the Jews dissembled, excuse me. And the rest of the Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that even Barnabas was carried away with their dissimulation. When Peter, an apostle and recognized leader of the church, withdrew from eating with the Gentiles, it was more than some of the rest of the Jews could bear. Even Barnabas, Paul's companion and trusted ally. Let's remember that Barnabas came with Paul to the Jerusalem council. Now, Barnabas was so influenced by Peter's actions that he even caved a little bit. Barnabas, Paul's companion and trusted ally on the trip to Jerusalem, yielded and joined in with their withdrawal from the Gentiles. Peter should have stood strong on this occasion, recognizing that his failure would cause others to stumble. We could talk about that all day long, about the need for us to stand strong. The church needed a leader, and Peter missed the mark, and because of it, other Jews stumbled and fell in with Peter's transgression. We could do a whole series of lessons on that. Those who are the spiritual leaders in the church then and today have a serious responsibility to live as an example to others. When a spiritual leader stumbles and falls, many who look up to them as examples find themselves shaken in their convictions and will stumble as well. It is important for those who take on the responsibilities of elders, deacons, preachers, and teachers of the Word to recognize this and order their lives with this in mind. The inspired words of James in chapter 3, 1 through 2 are appropriate. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Those who are teachers and spiritual leaders have an awesome responsibility and must conduct their lives as if others are watching all of the time. Bobby and I and Joe back there teaching the teenagers and Denise teaching the young, we are going to have a little bit stricter of a judgment because we're trying to teach and we're assuming the roles of teachers within the congregation, trying to help with the edification. If we don't live the way we preach and teach and guide others, then our judgment is going to be so much the more strict. And that is a serious thing that anybody who would be a teacher needs to keep in mind. We have a little bit higher standard that we have to live by, that we have to reach for. And that's something that we need to recognize whenever we stand up here in front of everybody. And it says that right there in James. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. I don't know how to say that any more plainly. That is a serious thing. Okay, we are ready for Galatians 2:14. But when I saw, that's Paul speaking, that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Cephas, that being Peter, before them all, publicly, if thou being a Jew livest as do the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, how compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Paul, an ever bold and staunch supporter of the truth, confronted Peter with his error in front of everyone present on that occasion. Peter was guilty of hypocrisy. He was a natural-born Jew who had abandoned the abrogated, the fulfilled, the ended, it's done law of Moses, and was living a Christian life just like the rest of the Gentiles. Yet, when confronted with the racial prejudice of the Judaizers, he, with his actions in withdrawing from the Gentile Christians, was compelling them to live as do the Jews who were still practicing Judaism. In other words, Peter had rejected the law of Moses, and he was living the life of a Christian. He had rejected the law of Moses. He was not living according to the law of Moses. But then he turned around and was compelling the Gentile brethren to do so whenever he withdrew from them. In other words, Paul is saying, you have rejected the law of Moses. You're not living by the law of Moses. So how come now you're turning around by your actions saying the Gentiles do? That's hypocrisy. That is hypocrisy in its purest state. And that's a pretty good place for us to stop right there. We will pick up again in Galatians 2:14, and we'll finish up there next week. Thank you all so much.